Once upon a time, there was a girl who didn't know she was a legend. Her throne was a cracked wooden platform in a forgotten theater in Houston, where the air was as heavy as cotton soaked in sweat. At 7 years old, Beyoncé Knowles faced her first court, a children's beauty pageant where judges dressed in satin and prejudice dictated who deserved to shine. Her curly hair, defying gravity, was an unwritten manifesto. Her yellow dress, sewn by her mother during sleepless nights, smelled of hope and fabric glue. But the world was already whispering her sins. Envy arrived first, disguised as a condescending smile. One of the judges, with red nails as sharp as daggers, murmured into the microphone, "Hair like that is not for a princess. It looks like a nest of snakes." The words echoed like a bronze bell, hammering in the soul of that child who, for the first time, felt the weight of being too much in a world that asked for less. Her little fingers trembled, tightening the satin bow until the laces tore. An involuntary act of wrath, the fire that burned in her veins before she even learned to name it. Gluttony lurked in the shadows, the world's hunger for docile bodies, for contained laughter, for tiny existences. They wanted to devour her, chew up her authenticity and spit out a porcelain doll. But there, between the dusty curtains of the stage, the inner child resisted, that part of her that still believed that singing in the rain could cure any pain. Meanwhile, sloth tried to seduce her. "Give up, it's not worth it." But her bare feet, marked by secret dances in the backyard, already knew how to follow the rhythm of her own courage. It was then that Tina Knowles entered the scene, bringing with her the smell of cold coffee and endless Mondays. Her hands, calloused from cutting daytime fabrics and combing nighttime stories, picked red roses from the abandoned theater garden. Each flower was a trap, the thorns cut into her skin, and the blood ran down like threads of lust, not the lust of the body, but of the spirit that refuses to be invisible. One by one, she wove the petals into her daughter's curls, turning wounds into adornment. "Pain is just paint," Tina whispered, as the bright red blended with the faded yellow. "You will paint worlds with it." On stage, under a spotlight that glittered like dragon eyes, Beyoncé took a deep breath. The greed of the world roared in her ears. Be small, be palatable, be anything but yourself. But in her chest, the child within raised a flag made of high school dreams and Billie Holiday verses. When she opened her mouth to sing at last, a splinter of rose pierced her ear. The blood ran down, warm and golden, dyeing her dress a new hue. The red of vanity turned sacred. In the audience, the silhouettes of the 7 sins danced like shadows on a runaway merry-go-round. But something magical happened. Each drop of blood that touched the ground blossomed into rare, resilient black flowers. The child within, the one who still collected shiny stones and believed in fairies, whispered, "They call you imperfect, but you are a mosaic. Every splinter of you, every scar is a fragment of a star." Years later, revisiting this memory in a velvet-covered journal, Beyoncé would write, "Pride is not the absence of pain. It is the decision to use each thorn as the foundation for the crown that only you can bear." And so, the girl who bled on small stages learned to transform scars into constellations, because even the darkest night needs stars to tell its story. The dressing room was a sanctuary of heavy silences. Beyoncé stared at her reflection in the fogged-up mirror, where the names of fans, critics, and her own doubts were etched in pencil, like scars from an invisible war. On the shelves, the trophies gleamed under cold lights. Grammys, MTV Awards, golden statues that looked like sentinels of a kingdom she had built herself, brick by brick, with dreams and sweat. The air there smelled of diamond dust and dried tears, a bitter perfume of victories that cost lost childhoods. She ran her fingers over the icy surface of a Grammy, feeling its sharp edges cut her skin. A drop of blood ran over the gold, drawing a microscopic river on the marble. "Why does everything that shines have to hurt so much?" whispered a childish voice, echoing from a place she tried to forget. It was her inner child, the one who still wore fake pearl necklaces and believed that singing in the backyard was enough to make her happy. But the adult world had taught her other names for pain: greed, for the gold that never filled the void; envy, for the anonymous letters that hissed, "You'll never be Whitney"; vanity, for the daily ritual of counting wrinkles as if they were sins. In the hidden drawer of her dressing room, she hid a forbidden treasure, a string of plastic pearls, faded by time. It was the relic of a 12-year-old Beyoncé, who rehearsed Destiny's Child choreography in rooms without air conditioning, barefoot and with a light heart. The inner child still lived in that fragile object, reminding her of when to shine meant to laugh, not to survive. But the demons of the present whispered louder. Sloth advised, "Give up. Turn your back on the fire." Lust, not for someone else's body, but for impossible perfection, dragged her into nights of endless rehearsals, where her feet bled to the rhythm of a ballad. She put on her stilettos, each studded with 300 crystals that sparkled like frozen tears. As she took her first step, a mirror shattered. Between the shards, versions of herself were reflected. The girl from Houston in torn slippers and a toy microphone. The diva in impossible dresses, carrying the weight of an empire. "You promised we would be free," the child's voice accused. Now trembling. "Why have we become slaves to our own brilliance?" Then rage exploded, rage against the spotlights that burned her retinas, against contracts that froze her voice, against the pride that kept her from shouting, "Enough!" Pride was her only shield, but shields are heavy. With trembling hands, she picked up an iron hammer used to adjust scenery. She took a deep breath, as she did before going on stage, and struck a sharp blow against a diamond the size of a fist. The stone shattered into 1,000 particles, and in the center of the brilliant chaos, a crumpled photo was revealed. She and Solange, children, with paper crowns and wide smiles, missing baby teeth. It was there, among the wreckage of the most expensive jewel she owned, that she found true light. Not the light of the blinding shine, but the light of the inner child, who still knew how to smile with her eyes closed. The one who understood that diamonds are just carbon under pressure, and that she had been carbon, pressure, and light long before she was a star. She scattered the golden powder in the air, watching it dance like cosmic dust. In the reflection of the broken mirror, she saw herself merge with the girl she had been, hands clasped, promises renewed. The weight of the shine only exists if carried alone. Share it with the person you were and with the person you still dream of being. The studio was a maze of broken reflections. Beyoncé walked in slowly, barefoot, feeling the shards of glass beneath her feet like fallen stars. The mirrors, broken at brutal angles, multiplied her body into thousands of fragments. Here, an elongated leg. There, a blurred face. Further on, an eye that wept tears of black ink. The air smelled of plaster dust and nail polish, an acidic mixture that burned the throat. It was there, in that sanctuary of piercing silences, that she would face the most dangerous of sins, herself. The first image that faced her was that of the diva, impeccable, golden, wearing a dress that weighed more than her past. "You have to be perfect," whispered that reflection, its voice as sweet as poisoned honey. It was vanity, disguised as advice. But right next to it, another shard showed the mother, Beyoncé holding blue ivy, her eyes swollen from sleepless nights and bottles forgotten in the microwave. "It's never enough," this version murmured, accused by greed of not being enough. She stepped forward and the mirrors shattered further, revealing the lover, the Beyoncé of partition, shrouded in mist and secrets. "You're too much to want," Lust laughed, as the reflection's fingers traced forbidden lines on her neck. But in the darkest corner, the inner child appeared, the 9-year-old girl with scraped knees and a Walkman hanging from her waist. "Why did you stop listening to the songs that made you dance just for the sake of dancing?" she asked, her voice a mix of guilt and innocence. Envy then struck. In a knife-shaped mirror, Beyoncé saw herself copying Josephine Baker's steps, Tina Turner's clothes, Whitney's smile. None of them needed to be you to be eternal. spat the reflection. But the inner child counterattacked, throwing a cassette tape of Survivor on the floor. The song played, distorted, and Beyoncé remembered when imperfection was allowed, even celebrated. Sloth tried to seduce her. Sit down, rest, let others carry your light. But her feet, scarred by decades of choreography, refused to obey. She danced. Each movement was a blow against the mirrors, each turn a challenge to sins. She bled from her ankles, but she didn't stop. Then anger appeared, incarnated in a deformed reflection that screamed, "Break it all, destroy those who doubted you." That was when the inner child took her hand. Together they gathered up the sharpest shards, each representing a sin, a criticism, a mask. Carefully they glued them to the floor, forming a mosaic of her face. It wasn't perfect. The cracks were visible, the colors clashed. But for the first time, it was whole. "Pride isn't loving yourself as smooth," the child whispered, holding a shard where Beyoncé laughed with her tongue out, as she did in her childhood rehearsals. "It's recognizing yourself in the cracks." As she left the studio, Beyoncé left the door open. The morning light streamed in, reflecting off the mosaic of mirrors. From a distance, it looked like a constellation, each star a fragment of who she was, is, and will be. And in the center, a phrase scratched in dried blood: "Our cracks are where the light enters and where our truth escapes." The attic of her childhood home in Houston held dusty secrets. Beyoncé climbed the creaky wooden stairs, guided by the scent of dried jasmine and church candles her grandmother lit to bless the seeds. In the rusty metal box, she found her treasure: faded photos of women with skin as dark as ebony, modest dresses, and eyes that defied the world without raising their voices. Among the images was a pressed rose, picked from her great-grandmother's garden, where she planted flowers between the rows of cotton as a silent act of rebellion. The child within emerged, sitting cross-legged on the floor in ripped jeans. "Who are they?" she asked, pointing to the photos. Beyoncé didn't answer. Instead, she ran her fingers over the faces of her ancestors, feeling their stories like an electric current. Grandma Hattie, a washerwoman who sang spirituals as she wrung out other people's clothes. Mother Tina, sewing dresses for other people's daughters on machines that stopped working at midnight. And she herself, small and clumsy, in the church choir, wearing a dress that was 3 sizes too big. "Why do we keep so much?" the child asked, holding a photo of Tina with her hands bandaged, injured by needles and overtime. The answer came, in the form of greed. Not greed for money, but greed for memory. To prove that we exist. In the dark corners of the attic, sins whispered. Envy of families that had stable roots, not broken by slavery. Sloth that said, "Leave the past buried." But the flower pressed into the album page suddenly blossomed, black petals opening like hands in prayer. It was the inheritance of flowers, a symbolism that her great-grandmother understood, to plant beauty where the soil has been poisoned. Beyoncé recalled the silent lessons, Tina sewing scraps of discarded fabric into colorful quilts, her grandmother watering flower beds at midnight as if she were cultivating dreams, not geraniums. Vanity tried to scoff. What can fragile flowers do against the world? But the inner child, now holding a paper rose in her hand, replied, "Fragile flowers break through concrete." On stage at the Formation World Tour, Beyoncé wore a dress that weighed centuries. The print wasn't floral, it was roots of African baobabs, Brazilian mango trees, oaks under which escaped blacks plotted their freedom. Her every move shook the fabric, and from the roots sprouted hologram-projected flowers, hibiscus, daisies, and the black roses from her attic. Ancestral rage pulsed in the sound of the drums. Lust for justice became the chorus. "Okay, ladies, now let's get in formation." And pride, after all, wasn't just hers, it was collective. As she sang, she saw a girl in the audience holding a photo of her own grandmother. Beyoncé's inner child smiled. They're here. They've always been. At the end of the show, she threw seeds into the audience, seeds of rare flowers picked from the garden her grandmother Hattie tended. "Plant them where the world says nothing grows," she said, as women picked them up like heirlooms. On the screen, a phrase echoed her great-grandmother's diary, found in that same metal box. "We don't just inherit the pain, we inherit the seeds that conquered the high dryness." That night, back in the attic, Beyoncé placed a new photo in the box. Herself holding hands with blue ivy, surrounded by flowers growing from cracks in the asphalt. Her inner child carefully closed the lid, whispering, "Now we are the root and the flower, and one day they will be the seeds." The dance studio was silent, lit only by a single spotlight that cast a pale circle on the worn wooden floor. Beyoncé entered barefoot, her feet scarred from past choreography. In the center of the light, a crown of thorns rested on an old grand piano, sharp black entwined with red silk threads. She recognized the symbol, a trap and an invitation. Her eyes found its reflection in the cracked mirror behind the piano. There, a girl with tight braids and a faded pink tutu watched her. It was her inner child, the 8-year-old version who still believed that dancing cured everything. "They'll hurt you," the girl warned, pointing to the crown. Beyoncé smiled, lifting the object with steady hands. "They've hurt me before. This time I'll dance with the thorns." The first note rang out, an out-of-tune violin, wailing like an ancient lament. Beyoncé placed the crown on her head. The thorns pierced her forehead gently, and blood ran down in thin streams, dyeing the red silk a darker shade. Then the shadows appeared, emerging from the corners of the studio like personifications of the 7 sins. Pride, greed, wrath, envy, lust, gluttony, sloth, each taking on grotesque forms distorted by the reflection of the broken mirror. Pride came first, a towering figure crowned with fake diamonds that sparkled in the dim light. He trailed chains made of trophies, Grammys, statuettes, magazine covers. "You're nothing without these chains," he roared, shaking the awards like shackles. Beyoncé laughed, remembering the words her mother Tina had said when she won. Her first trophy in high school. "Trophies are heavy, bae. Carry them on your back, not in your heart." The child within ran to the piano and played a high note, breaking Pride's spell. The chains crumbled to dust, and Beyoncé danced over the wreckage, turning each step into a verse from Formation. Greed followed, skeletal hands clutching, dollar bills that crumbled into sand. "It's never enough, is it?" he hissed, throwing sand into his eyes. Beyoncé closed her eyes, letting the memory guide her. At age 12, on a cramped bus with Destiny's Child, sharing a peanut butter sandwich with Kelly and Michelle. The child within placed a necklace of fake pearls in her hands, the same one she had worn back then. "True wealth is what you share," the girl whispered. Beyoncé hurled the necklace at Greed, who disintegrated into a cloud of golden dust. Wrath struck like a hurricane, whipping the air with a rope of spikes. One blow struck Beyoncé's arm, leaving a deep cut. Blood flowed, but she turned the pain into motion, spinning like a whirlwind as she sang, "Don't hurt yourself," in a hoarse whisper. Each drop that fell to the ground sprouted red chrysanthemums, which burned away the remaining shadows. The child within gathered the fallen thorns and began to weave a new crown, intertwining them with paper flowers. "Remember when you broke the dressing room mirror?" She laughed, referring to a memory from 2003, when Beyoncé, frustrated with a rehearsal, destroyed her own reflection. "You always knew how to turn anger into art." Envy then approached, copying Beyoncé's every move with robotic precision. "Do you want to be her, or you?" the shadow teased, replicating single ladies with empty perfection. Beyoncé stopped, looked into the figure's lifeless eyes and hugged her. "I envied you too," she confessed. "I envied Aaliyah's lightness, Whitney's voice, even Rihanna's freedom." The shadow wavered, disintegrating into stardust. The child within blew the dust toward the mirror, where it formed the word unicorn, a nickname Beyoncé had as a child, when people told her she was too magical to be real. Lust enveloped her in translucent veils that smelled of jasmine and ash. "You are theirs, not yours," the shadow whispered as the veils pulled her into a hypnotic dance routine to Partition. Beyoncé closed her eyes and saw herself at 15, dancing and hiding in the attic to Prince. She tore the veils apart with sudden movements and shouted, "Lust is not about pleasure, it's about power." Behind the torn fabrics, she revealed, the teenager who defied the world with a Walkman and dreams. The child within handed her the device. "Play your truth," she said. The song that emerged was Purple Rain, but with lyrics in Yoruba, a tribute to the roots that never stopped. Beating, gluttony swallowed the spotlight, plunging the studio into darkness. Beyoncé heard the sound of teeth grinding, of an insatiable appetite. The child within turned on a dim flashlight, revealing photos on the floor. Beyoncé at age 6, eating red velvet cake at her grandmother's house, smiling with a missing tooth. "You don't have to eat the world," the girl said, offering an imaginary piece of cake. Beyoncé bit the air. The dressing room smelled of disinfectant and coconut oil, a scent Beyoncé had for years associated with preparation and purification. Before her, on a cool marble counter, was a plate of grilled chicken, unsalted spinach, and perfectly measured quinoa. Everything was calculated, controlled, safe. Post-it notes proclaimed on the mirror, "Perfection is not an accident, and hunger is weakness leaving the body." She lifted her fork, but her hand shook. In the reflection, among the yellow papers, a little girl in a floral dress appeared, chocolate smears on her face, holding a piece of red velvet cake. It was her inner child, 7 years old, with crumbs in her teeth and a laugh that echoed like a distant drum. "Why don't you eat?" the little girl asked. Beyoncé didn't answer. She just felt the emptiness in her stomach, a hole that neither the quinoa nor the applause could fill. In her grandmother's kitchen, the air was heavy with brown, sugar, and cinnamon. Beyoncé, 9, climbed onto a wooden stool to reach the bowl where her grandmother Hattie was mixing the red velvet cake batter. "Be careful with the yeast, Bay," Hattie said, wearing a flowered apron and holding a wooden spoon. "If you add too much, the cake will rise and collapse. If you add too little, it will be hard as a rock. You have to do it just right." Child within, the Beyoncé who still stole spoonfuls of frosting, hid under the table, licking her sticky fingers. The old oven hissed, releasing a scent of vanilla and childhood. When the cake was ready, Hattie cut a generous slice and placed it in front of her granddaughter. "Food is not a sin, you know. It's a celebration." Beyoncé bit into the cake, the deep red staining her lips like lipstick. The flavor was sweet, earthy, vivid. Years later, Beyoncé would understand that this cake was more than a recipe. It was a code. Her grandmother, the granddaughter of slaves, had learned to turn leftovers into feasts. Moldy flour became molasses bread. Fruit peels became jam. "Our magic is to make nothing become everything," Hattie said, as Beyoncé smeared her face with slop. In March 2020, the world stopped. For Beyoncé, whose life revolved around tours, rehearsals, and the spotlight, the silence that followed felt like an intimate earthquake. In her Los Angeles mansion, the hallways that had once been filled with the laughter of crew members and the buzz of suitcases echoed only the ticking of forgotten clocks. For the first time in decades, she found herself in front of a mirror without makeup, without glittering costumes, without the persona the world demanded. The reflection was just a woman, not a diva, not a legend, but someone who needed to learn how to breathe again. In those endless days, as the rain pattered lightly on the windows, Beyoncé remembered Houston, when storms were invitations to TV movie marathons, with Tina baking chocolate chip cookies and Solange making up dance routines on the living room rug. At 11, she was already escaping the stillness, filling every minute with exhausting rehearsals. But now, isolated, she relived the scene of a rainy afternoon in 1992, sitting on the floor of her sister's room, hugging a rag doll, while Solange danced alone. "I don't want to dance today," she had murmured, exhausted. Her inner child, the girl with tight braids who collected shiny stones, had whispered, "It's okay to just exist." The pandemic brought this lesson home. Amidst the global chaos, Rumi and Sir, her children, invaded her routine of self-demand with colorful umbrellas and loud laughter. "Let's jump in the rain," they demanded, dragging her out into the garden. Barefoot, she felt the wet grass beneath her feet, the water running down her face like an involuntary baptism. Rumi spun around until she fell, drenched in happiness. Sir tried to swallow drops, laughing out loud. Beyoncé, motionless, let herself be overwhelmed by a truth. There was no audience there, no one to applaud, criticize, or demand. Just existing. Imperfect, unprotected, human. In her home studio, the grand piano that had been her work tool for years became her confidant. On silent afternoons, she would let her fingers wander over the keys, creating nameless melodies without pressure. Disjointed notes became "Tea Time for the Doll," a song that would never be a single, but carried the lightness of days without. Clock. One morning, Blue Ivy walked into the studio, looked at her mother and asked, "Can I play with you?" Together they composed Brown Skin Girl. The Grammy that would come later was no comparison to the sparkle in Blue's eyes when she heard her own voice on the recording. An invisible trophy, made of maternal pride and complicity. Beyoncé revisited memories that the pandemic brought to the surface, fainting during the Formation tour, the doctor warning her, "Your body is not a machine," and her ignoring it, returning to the stage 48 hours later. Now, in front of the bathroom mirror, she stared at the scar on her knee, a mark from a fall that symbolized years of self-exhaustion. Her inner child appeared in the reflection, sticking a unicorn band-aid over the wound. "You don't have to prove yourself strong all the time." When the world resumed its rhythm, Beyoncé surprised. In her first post-pandemic show, she sat on the empty stage, wrapped in a white silk robe. The old piano from Tina's house was her only accompanist. "This song is for those who have learned to listen to silence," she said, before playing "Tea Time for the Doll." The audience, accustomed to impeccable choreography, cried when they heard verses about tired mothers, postponed dreams, and the beauty of days without agendas. Backstage, Rumi and Sir slept under a blanket that Tina had knitted during isolation, a legacy of a time when slowness became a legacy. Today, Beyoncé observes a Holy Thursday every week. There are no rehearsals, meetings, or goals. Sometimes she draws dragons with Rumi. Other times she listens to Sir tell stories about dinosaurs dancing ballet. When Sloth's shadow whispers, "You should be working," she responds with heart-shaped pancakes and laughter on the porch. In the attic of her house, Solange's toy piano rests next to golden figurines. Beyoncé plays its rusty keys, and the off-key notes sound like a revolution. Because resting, she has learned, is also resistance. And so, between silences that teach and laughter that heals, Beyoncé rewrites her myth. Not as the woman who never stops, but as someone who discovered that pausing is sometimes the most courageous art.